Let's get things underway. My name is Peter Beinart. I am a professor here at the Graduate Center in the Journalism School, and I'm very, very honored to be joined to my left by Daisy Khan, who is an advocate for women's empowerment and who runs WISE, which stands for the Women's Islamic Initiative for Spirituality and Equality. Her book, Community Guide Against Extremism, will come out in July, and she may be perhaps most famous for the controversy over the Ground Zero Mosque a few years ago here in New York. Which was neither at Ground Zero nor a mosque. That's why I put it in quotation marks, but I'm sure we'll hear more about it. And to my right is my old dear friend Arslan Iftikhar, who is an international human rights lawyer, the author of Islamic Pacifism and his new book, Scapegoats: How Islamophobia Helps Our Enemies and Threatens Our Freedom, which is coming out when?
4 weeks.
4 weeks, great. Don't forget your microphones. I'm really so happy that that the CUNY Graduate Center is hosting this discussion, because it seems to me we live in a moment in American public life in which there's an enormous amount of discussion about Islam and about American Muslims, but not very much discussion from American Muslims and by American Muslims, who I think are still woefully underrepresented in our public discussion, which is part of the reason the conversation is often, strikes me, is so characterized by deep ignorance, and if not outright bigotry. So I wanted to start just by asking both Daisy and Arslan about, at a personal level, from inside the American Muslim community, what it has been like to be an American Muslim in the shadow of the Donald Trump campaign, the front runner for a major presidential candidate's presidential nomination, who is called for, among other things, banning Muslims from entering the country. So I just wanted to ask you, start with Daisy, what has these last few months been like?
Actually, we were expecting this.
Really?
Yeah, because last time, as you mentioned, the controversy over the community center that we were trying to build, which was meant to reverse the trend of extremism, give voice to the moderate Muslims, so that we can amplify our voices, we suddenly found ourselves in midterm elections, and we became the wedge issue. And then when Bloomberg came forward, he said, in September, they're all going to pack up and leave. And that's exactly what happened. So we knew that this election, that Islam was also going to become a wedge issue. So it's no longer just a community center. Now it's Islam and Muslims that are the wedge issue. So we were kind of expecting this. But what we didn't expect was that it was going to be Trump who was going to be running the show, a fellow New Yorker. And we are as nervous as all other Americans are as to the prospect of what's going to happen in this country. So it's not just about our religion, it really is even about America itself. So we fear for America.
And Arslan, what is your experience of this been like?
Well, I think we can't have a discussion about the 2016 presidential election and the role of Islamophobia without looking at the 2008 presidential election of Barack Hussein Obama. So very quickly here, by show of hands, how many people in this room at some point in your life have heard this sentence, Barack Obama is a Muslim? And every single person has now raised their hand. And I feel like whenever somebody says Barack Obama is a Muslim, that Jerry Seinfeld should pop out and say, not that there's anything wrong with that. Because essentially, during the 2008 presidential election, saying Barack Obama is a Muslim was kind of some people's way of saying that Barack Obama is black. That was their way of otherizing him in a way that was socially acceptable, and that's carried over to the 2016 presidential elections, where now we're not only seeing people like Donald Trump calling for the banning of Muslims, or Muslims having to wear special IDs, but even other candidates like Ted Cruz saying that we need to patrol Muslim neighborhoods. I can tell you that if you patrol Muslim neighborhoods, the only thing you're going to get are some of the best falafels and kebabs you've ever had in your life. But the fact that we can talk about major minority demographic groups with impunity, and I've said this on NBC News Meet the Press, I've said this on CNN, and I will say it here tonight to Donald Trump. If you can replace the word Muslims with Jews and sound like a Nazi, you probably shouldn't say these things. And so it's important for us to be able to speak out as allies, regardless of whether we are Muslim, Jewish, gay, straight, immigrant, non-immigrant, for people who are being disenfranchised or marginalized within our socio-political zeitgeist, because otherwise we're going to see these presidential candidates continue to speak out like this with impunity.
Is this kind of spasm of Islamophobia that we're seeing at its height now with the Trump campaign, is it changing the daily lives of American Muslims? Are people having to live differently day to day because of the shadow of this political fear that's being created?
The short answer is yes. I mean, we're starting, as a civil rights lawyer, you know, we're starting to see a spate of bullying against young Muslim kids at schools who are being called ISIS on the playgrounds, Muslim girls who wear the headscarf, who are, again, being called ISIS and having their headscarves removed. I mean, it's important to keep in mind that, you know, this whole spate of Islamophobia that we've seen in the last 15 years is really challenging the innate Americanness of the American Muslim community. So, for example, somebody like myself, who was born and raised in the United States, I'm not seen as an American because of my religion and the color of my skin. For example, I once gave a live nationally televised debate on a news network that will remain nameless, Fox News. And as soon as we cut to commercial, I'm sitting at the anchor desk with the news anchor, and they're taking off my microphone and my makeup, and the news anchor looks at me and she goes, "That was a great interview. Your accent didn't come through at all. Where are you from?" And I said, "Chicago." And she goes, "No, where are you really from?" And I said, "Chicago." And she asked me a third time, "Where are you really from?" And I said, "Chicago," and I walked out of the studio. She could not fathom that a brown man would be able to walk into her television studio, be able to articulate himself in a live 7-minute nationally televised debate without having some sort of stereotypical bobble-headed accent. And so the notion of the Muslims or Islam being of the other is part of what's perpetuating a lot of the ignorance that we're seeing today.
And Daisy, what are you seeing? I mean, when you talk to people in the American Muslim community today, are people questioning whether they can truly be accepted in the United States? Has it changed people's relationships with coworkers? I mean, how is it filtering down to people's day-to-day lived experience?
So there are many ways that this is manifesting. At the personal level, people are getting really concerned about being seen as a Muslim. So there is a shying away from the faith itself. I mean, many people are changing their names. You know, if you're Muhammad, you're Mo. If you're Harun, you're Harry. And that's like self-preservation. People have to do that. The Jewish community did that, and the Muslims are doing that. Because they don't want to be singled out when their resumes are going they just don't, they want equal opportunity. So at the personal level, that's what's happening. But those have long-lasting effects on an entire community when an entire generation begins to shy away from its own faith. Then the younger people themselves are feeling, I just heard a colleague of mine just told me that the suicide hotline has a lot of Muslims calling in. So young people don't know how to process this information. It's really hard for them to process because they're born and raised here, and they don't understand why they're being called ISIS when they're not. They're living in good homes. So that's another major concern. And the third one is it's actually ironically having a huge mobilizing effect on the civil liberties front, because many people are going out there and doing voter registration at the highest rates I've seen. People are telling people to go out there and vote them out, or use your ballot box, use this opportunity that you have as an American to assert your right as an American. And then finally, I think that the other thing that is deeply concerning to American Muslims is that the foundational values of Islam, which are very similar to the foundational values of America, because we believe in human equality, we believe in freedom, and all of those things, many of you are saying, well, that's not what we see on television, and I don't blame you for thinking that because that's not what you see. But we are bought into America. We are invested in this country, and those foundational values are being challenged as if we are the other, as if, our religion somehow promotes something different, and this is why you're seeing all this anti-Sharia legislation, as if we're going to bring something from overseas. And to some extent, this is not that dissimilar to what happened with other faith communities. I think the struggle is one of acceptance. If you're looking at the grand picture, one of being accepted as an equal in this country, which pre-9/11 we were just doing fine. And it's ironic that this is happening, 15 years after 9/11.
So, Arslan, is that what you're seeing too? On the one hand, an instinct, two contradictory impulses. On the one instinct to keep your head down, to try not to let people know that you are Muslim, and then on the other, an attempt to enter into American politics in order to change the dynamic so that people like Trump can't succeed?
Well, yeah, I think to an extent that's correct. I think what's important to keep in mind again is that just like any other group, Islam and Muslims are not a monolithic entity. You know, far too many Americans, believe the misnomers that all Arabs are Muslims, that all Muslims are Arabs, and vice versa. You know, the largest swaths of the American Muslim community are African Americans, followed by South Asians, and then Arab Americans. The fact that we have been in this country as early as when the slave ships brought over African slaves to this nation. That the greatest athlete ever, Muhammad Ali, the funniest guy in America, Dave Chappelle, are all Muslims. Like that, we have been part and parcel of American society. But we were talking about the effect that it's having on people. I'm starting to hear, believe it or not, of Muslim doctors around the country who are saying that patients are now actually refusing care from them. And I'm like, wow, if you're going to refuse patient care, hospital care from a Muslim doctor, you're good luck finding care in some parts of this country. But it's having a real impact on people. And what's important to keep in mind, and I cannot reiterate this enough, is what Donald Trump is doing is exactly what ISIS wants. That has to be highlighted over and over again. I promise you, they are playing his sound bites to potential recruits out there saying, see, America is against Islam. America is at war with Muslims. Now, it's the job of intellectuals like Daisy and myself to go out there and actually, push back on that narrative because, it's interesting. When I go on CNN, I'm always seen as the Muslim guy, but when I go on Al Jazeera, I'm always seen as the American guy. So I'm screwed either way. So when I go on CNN, it's always like, well, why aren't you Muslims condemning terrorism? And when I go on Al Jazeera, it's why aren't you Americans shutting down Guantanamo Bay? And I'm like, whoa, slow down. And it's important for us again not to view any demographic as a monolith. And I think when we start to look at nuance and get to the humanization aspect of getting to know one another, I think that's really the only way that we're going to make any sort of incremental change.
So Daisy, I wanted to ask you, one of the big topics of discussion has been this question about radicalization and, how prone are American Muslims to be sympathetic to ISIS, and could some of the same phenomenon that we've seen in some parts of Europe where some young people, for whatever set of reasons, become attracted to this radical ideology. How should we think about this question, and what's the right way to have that kind of conversation?
First of all, I think we have to really distinguish between the American Muslim community and the European Muslim community. I've traveled to Europe, I see that community. Although it has the same roots, like, there would be pockets of Turkish community in Germany, pockets of Moroccan community in Netherlands, you don't see the kind of deep diversity of Muslims that you see in America. So we, Muslims in America, pretty much are, I would say, have the deepest and the deepest diversity that you see in the world, next to the annual Hajj, where Muslims from all over the world go. So you not only see the diversity, you see people who came in the 60s as doctors. My uncle was invited to the United States, and there might be some people in this room that were invited as doctors to the United States. So there was a professional class of people that came here, and many of their children are well integrated, go to Ivy League schools, are smart people like Arsalan, who know how to talk English without an accent. But what I'm saying is that it's a very different community. It's an upwardly mobile, highly aspiring community. This is not the same community as, and this is why it hurts so much, because we're giving back so much to this country. Dr. Oz is a Muslim, Fareed Zakaria is a Muslim. All the sports people many of the sports people that you love to watch are Muslim. They're giving back to America. So the same sort of alienation that is taking root in Europe because of socioeconomic reasons is not the same factor here. So the factors are slightly different here. You might have somebody who gets alienated because their rights are being discriminated. And that is why you see very small pockets. I mean, I think somebody said that 5% of violence that is committed here may be attributed to Muslims. I mean, we're talking mostly it's gun violence. It's hardly any incidences that happen at the hands of Muslim terrorists. But for us, even one incident is too many. San Benito is equal to us like, 10 gun violences, because it sets our community back by a decade. Because all of a sudden, the entire community is painted with one broad brush, and we are perceived through just the national security lens. We're not seen through the prism of what a vibrant community, what an exciting community. They're bringing hummus, they're bringing this great culture. We're not seeing through that. So unfortunately, that is, but I just do not see the comparisons. And that is why we're doing this community guide, is to make sure that Muslims are rapidly educated on how the recruiters are working and how the recruiters aspire to get to the United States, because they're using social media. So they can actually go and recruit somebody who's alienated sitting in their living room. You don't have to. These recruitments don't take place in mosques. Like Trump says, let's go watch all their mosques, or let's shut down all the mosques. That even if you listen to intel people, they'll tell you that's just not the reality. So we have to understand that the threat is very small. But for our community, even the smallest threat is a very big threat.
Nasa, I wanted to ask you about this question too. When you say Donald Trump is doing what ISIS wants, do you mean by that there is a danger that his rhetoric produces a greater risk of American Muslims becoming ISIS recruits, or did you mean something different?
Yes. I think, just to piggyback off what Daisy said, I think it all revolves around the fact that terrorism today only applies to acts of mass murder committed by brown Muslim men. And I have said this publicly, and I will continue to say it publicly. Before the San Bernardino massacre, the San Bernardino massacre was the 350th mass shooting last year in the year 2015. And the way that the media covered it, you would have thought that all 349 mass shootings before that were also committed by Muslims. And only 1 week before the San Bernardino massacre, a white man named Robert Deere walked into the Planned Parenthood clinic in Colorado Springs, Colorado. His own wife, in court filings last year, testified that he considered himself a soldier of Christ, and he gunned down people in an act of Christian terrorism, and it was never called Christian terrorism. Dylan Roof was a 21-year-old white supremacist who walked into a Charleston, South Carolina African-American church, sat in Bible study with them for 1 hour, and then proceeded to massacre 9 of the parishioners, including one South Carolina state senator for whom he had asked for by name. A man with a race war ideology trying to inflict generalized terror on a community was never called a domestic terrorist. The fact is that the term terrorism, sadly, has been co-opted to only apply to Muslim people, and that's where I think the dialogue has to begin. We have to call out the media on its double standard in terms of who it applies the term terrorism to and who it does not apply that same to as well.
I wanted to ask a little bit more about Islam in the United States. I think one of the things that people certainly know is true of Judaism is that the interaction with the United States changed Judaism. So you have versions of American Judaism, the conservative movement, for instance, or Reconstructionist Judaism emerged inside the United States as part of this interaction between the American ethos, the American experience, and a faith tradition that comes from outside. I'm wondering just what are we seeing in terms of what the interaction with the United States is doing in terms of people's experience as in terms of their experience of Islam. How is Islam changing as the result of now being now this increasing population of Muslims in the United States?
So like I mentioned, Islam in America is a very diverse, it's a faith community that spans all the nations of the world. And I think we have all ethnicities, all nationalities, and we have all the schools of thought as well. All the schools of thought literally mean that the various legal schools of thought where you have different interpretations for different things. So, in our mosque in Tribeca, when my husband was the imam there, it was very comical because we got people who were French Senegalese who had just landed, and then we had people who were Moroccans, and everybody was praying a little bit differently, thinking that their prayer was the most valid one and the other person's wasn't. It was just a small little example, but it just showed us that there are different interpretations, different schools of thought, and so what is going to dominate in this country? Which school of jurisprudence of Islamic thought should be the prevailing school of thought here? Should it be the more conservative one or the more liberal one? Now, this conversation and this challenge has been faced by Muslim communities when they went all the way from Arabia to Mesopotamia to all the great ancient Persia and the Indian subcontinent. They were able to restate the core values of their religion within the context of that society. That was happening here in the United States because now there are 28 million Muslims that live in all of the Western Hemisphere, right? So we have come from different nations. I'm talking about Europe and the United States. Although we represent a very small population of the United States, I think what are we, 3% or something like that? roughly. So we're not great challenge. But as a community, if we came up with a school of thought, it would greatly influence Europe as well, because Europe usually follows what happens in America. All of this got interrupted because of 9/11. Up until then, the community was evolving gradually like the Jewish community, actually modeling itself after the Jewish community. And why is that? Because Judaism does not have any central authority. Islam does not have any central authority. We don't have a pope, we don't have a church. And so therefore, it's the different schools of thought, the leaders of the different schools of thought that create a new, jurisprudence. So that would have happened here, but all of that has been interrupted because of the onslaught that is the constant onslaught that Muslims feel they're under. So we always feel we're under duress. We always feel we are defending. We're never thinking critically about what is possible. I'm talking broadly as a community. I'm not talking about individuals. Individuals are doing great work. And many people have said that Islam would rise from the West. I don't mean a revolution. I'm talking about rise in itself. It will rise again. It will give breath to the true Islam. But that, unfortunately, has been overshadowed by what's happened since 9/11 and most recently. But I do think that this is where the best jurisprudence is going to come from. I fundamentally believe that because we are a minority religion here, just like the Judaism has really evolved and flourished in this country, we have that potential as well.
Is that the way you see it, Arslan, too, that we're going to start to see an American version of Islam that is distinctive based on the experience of Muslims in the United States? And I'm also interested in whether you agree with Daisy's point that basically this process of cultural assimilation, of Americanization of Islam, of this kind of fruitful encounter between the two, has been in some ways retarded by since 9/11 by Islamophobia.
Yeah, I think I do agree with the notion that the future of Islam is going to come from the West, and particularly from the United States. And getting back a little bit into the demographics of the distinctions and the nuances between the American and the European Muslim communities, it actually goes back to immigration laws. Historically speaking, America has had very strict immigration laws, and because of that, the Muslim immigrants that have come to this country were primarily the brain drain of Muslim nations. It was the doctors, it was the engineers, it was the highly educated white-collar Muslims that were leaving their countries. Now, Europe, on the other hand, had something called the quote-unquote guest worker programs, which was essentially slave labor that they brought in in the 50s and 60s, primarily from the Maghreb, North Africa, certain parts of Turkey, and they were essentially bringing in the jobs that the white Europeans didn't want to do. The fatal flaw there was they thought that these people were eventually going to go back to their countries. Now, these were the less educated, blue-collar, working class of the Muslim countries. And so now, if you look at the diasporas, if you look at the American Muslim community, there are studies that show that 58% of American Muslims make over $75,000 a year. 41% of American Muslims have a graduate degree of some sort, not just a college degree. So we are the most economically empowered. We are the most we're the most educated diaspora anywhere in the Western world. And because of the diversity that Daisy was pointing to, because of that, that is where you're also going to see this sort of robust intellectual debates that we're starting to see, or that we have been seeing. And in a sense, this cultural assimilation, I hate the term assimilation, because assimilation denotes a one-way street. We're talking about integration. Integration is a two-way street, and I've done work with the European governments who love the word assimilation because they're like, you have to be like us. Well, you know what? A black Muslim man from Senegal cannot be like a white secular woman from Paris, France. It's just not going to happen. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that the majority of American Muslims are non-white. And so we do have that challenge on top of being a quote-unquote foreign religion, in that we're quote-unquote, again, foreign-looking. Like myself, for example, the example that I gave with Fox News. Peter, you and I could walk into Penn Station right now, and you would be considered American as a matter of course. I, as a 6'4" brown man, get stares every time I walk into an airplane. And that's why I wear pink to all my TV interviews and on planes. It's to let people know that you have nothing to worry about, right? But that's neither here nor there. So again, it's going to come from this humanization aspect. It's going to come from getting to know one another and understanding that not everything is a monolith, and that just because you happen to see things in a certain way on the evening news, that doesn't necessarily mean that is what is indicative of the entire community writ large.
One of the things, among the many kind of tropes that we tend to hear about Islam and Muslims in America, in addition to the discussion of violence and terrorism, is that Islam is behind Christianity and Judaism when it comes to gender relations. That maybe one day Islam will have a reformation, and and it'll become the experience of Islam will become progressive vis-a-vis women, but Islam hasn't gotten there yet for some reason. And I just wonder, when you hear that kind of discussion, how do you respond?
Well, once again, I really don't blame people for thinking that, because all they see is nose cuttings, acid throwing, honor killings, and I can't blame people because that's how their perceptions are shaped. They're shaped by what the media shows them. They don't know that gender equality is an intrinsic part of the Islamic faith, and that is why I am a living example of that. I mean, I was sent abroad from a little village in Kashmir. My grandfather came to Harvard many, many years before that. He sent my father, my uncle, everybody abroad to the United States to study here because he was the greatest country in the world. He said Islam is being practiced in its pristine form in the United States, although there was not a single Muslim here. And so when it was my turn, because I was an artist, and they didn't know what to do with me because the only two noble professions for women were either be a teacher or be a doctor, and I didn't want to be either, they said, no, your place is in America. And we were practicing Muslims. We were progressive for our times, but we were practicing Muslims. And this is the story of many Muslim women all over the world because we were granted rights in 7th century that Western women didn't have for much later. But what happens is, certain customs get encrusted on the religion, and what is happening in many parts of the world where you're seeing these kinds of rights, women being stripped of their rights, it's really culture or custom trumping religion. And so much so that, what the rights that you're being granted by religion are actually being co-opted because of local custom. And in the case of honor killings, that's a classic example. There's nothing in the Quran that says you have to kill somebody because of honor. It's a violation. But I think that many women in this room will remember that only 60 years ago, women didn't have the rights here, the same rights. And when I began my journey, I discovered there was such a thing as a suffragette movement in this country, which really fought for its rights. And so do you blame Christianity for women not having the same rights? No, of course we don't. We understand that it was not the religion, it was just the prevailing view. It was just how societies were structured. They were male-oriented, they were more patriarchal, woman's place was in the home, and in many cultures, you see that kind of thing being played out. But it's not all the cultures. If you just span the entire Muslim nations, there are about 56 or 57 nations, the reality of Muslim women is very different from society to society, partly because some societies are patriarchal and some are agrarian and some are matriarchal. So it's where you see the excesses against women are tribal societies and very patriarchal societies. But women's history in general has been one, and women's struggle is one. So the struggle that Muslim women are waging now is the same struggle that the suffragettes waged in this country. And that is why I'm standing on the shoulders of the suffragette, trying to create a modern-day suffragette movement for Muslim women so that they can regain their rightful, the rights that they have been granted by God. And I think that it's an important distinction for people to know that fundamentally it's not the religion, but it is co-opted by custom and culture, and that is something that is very easy to change. It's a matter of changing mindset.
So I wanted to talk about American foreign policy a little bit. How difficult is it for American Muslims to critique American foreign policy, given the political culture that we're in? And what do you think is the right way of understanding the relationship between American foreign policy in the Middle East and the wave of Islamophobia that we've been seeing?
Well, it's very easy because I do it all the time on television. But it's again, having the strength of self as an American to be able to call out your government whenever you see it doing things that you, in my case as a human rights lawyer, is in contravention of international humanitarian law. In the same breath that I can also criticize, Muslim extremists as a Muslim public intellectual, for their, dastardly acts of cowardice and terrorism. I think what's important to keep in mind is that nothing operates out of a vacuum. ISIS didn't just occur overnight. We tend to forget that this thing that we know as ISIS today, has spiraled based on the vacuum that we created in this during the Syrian civil war and then during the remnant and partially with the remnants of the Iraq war. But again, we tend to view these, ISIS people as, the X-Men or Transformers as though, they're unbeatable and they will be defeated. Because let's not forget, before ISIS, there was Al-Qaeda, and then in 2005, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi and Al-Qaeda in Iraq was supposed to be the baddest mofos ever on the face of the planet. And we have very short memories. Right now it's ISIS, tomorrow it'll be somebody else. During Vietnam, it was the Khmer Rouge. I actually liken ISIS a lot to the Khmer Rouge in terms of, basically a nihilistic cult who has, it's a bloodlust ideology. Their raison d'être is mayhem. It's not even to create chaos, it's mayhem. Again, ultimately, I believe that good will prevail. But again, we have to understand that, this is not just because brown people hate America. It's because America has fought 2 wars in predominantly Muslim countries, killing millions of innocent people, whether you believe rightfully or wrongfully. And, that ultimately, if we're going to have an intellectually honest discussion about, our modern realpolitik, you can't only just look at the aggressions or the wrongs that are being done from the East, but we also have to look self-reflectively within ourselves and call out our own government for the transgressions that we have made as Americans against the rest of the world as well.
And I wanted to ask you to look forward a little bit. American history is filled with these periods of extreme nativist fear and hostility, right? Almost every major American ethnic group, going back to German Americans or Irish Americans have experienced this. So, and we tend to tell these stories in a kind of optimistic way that, well, every group goes through this, but then they triumph and then they become really American and then they turn on the more recent immigrants, right? Do you think that if we were sitting here in this room 10 years from now, 20 years from now, we would look back and say, gosh, really, there was a lot of bad stuff going on, but now we've kind of passed through that? Or do you think that this Trump thing we could be living in this kind of moment for a long time, or God forbid, even worse?
That's a really good question, and I agree with the first part of your statement in that we are seeing some parallels of what we saw with German Americans and Catholics and Protestants and Japanese Americans in the internment camps of World War II, and obviously Jim Crow and the African American Civil Rights Movement, Jewish Americans. I think the one major difference is that I think, like you said earlier with your parallels to McCarthyism, I don't think any one of those minority demonizations was placed within a McCarthyist light. So, for example, we ended the Cold War because it was the end of the red communist threat, and you not only knew that we had a red communist threat during the Red Scare during the Cold War. By the politics and the media of the time, but you also look at Hollywood of the time, right? The Hunt for Red October, Red China. There was the proverbial Soviet communist boogeyman. And now it's turned from the Red Scare into the Green Scare. And now you look at Hollywood movies, you look at everything from Arnold Schwarzenegger's True Lies in 1994 and beyond with the Crimson Jihad moving forward, and everything within our pop culture zeitgeist, whether it's Homeland on Showtime with Claire Danes, 24 with Kiefer Sutherland. There was an entire season of the hit show 24 with Kiefer Sutherland, ladies and gentlemen, called The Enemy Next Door. And it was literally about a mother, a father, and a teenage son who were the sleeper cell next door, right? And so what this was telling Americans within our zeitgeist was that Muslims are not even safe to live next door to, and that actually manifested itself I think a USA Today poll from 2006, which showed that 24% of Americans, 1/4 of Americans said that they do not even want to have Muslims as their next door neighbors. So 1/4 of America does not want to live next door to me simply because of my faith. And so I think we do see parallels in terms of other civil rights movements from our historical past. But I think, sadly, it's going to get worse before it gets better because of the fact that many, sadly, Republicans and Republican presidential candidates have latched onto this notion of the proverbial Muslim boogeyman, and this is a way they can score cheap political points and without much pushback from our Democratic allies.
I'm interested in that last point in particular. Do you agree, Daisy?
Can I just
yes,
add
please.
to what Arslan said? I think the other thing that if we didn't have a footprint in major Muslim lands, and we didn't know when it was going to end, I could have said, yes, maybe the American Muslim community can assert itself and can do a lot of outreach and put all these things into place. Maybe the media can change the narrative, and maybe we can be accepted like the Irish did, and like the Italians did, and like the Jews did. But we are a community under duress, partly because we're seen through the lens of the national security lens. And that has to do with that our intervention and our interaction with Muslims globally, and literally having military operations running. And so I want to be optimistic about it, but unless and until we resolve some major conflicts in which we are leading the charge, either we resolve these conflicts, and I'm hoping that in a decade we can be out of these countries and peace treaties will be created, and then maybe the Muslim community can assert itself differently from the global Muslim community.
And I wanted to just end by picking up on the last thing that Arslan just said, which is, I think if I get you right, you said that you didn't feel like the Democratic Party had pushed back very effectively. So talk to me about that a little bit. What do you think Hillary Clinton deserves credit for, or Barack Obama? Where do you think they have failed in terms of responding to this moment?
Oh man, how much time do we have? I think actually, the example that comes to mind is actually Daisy's Park 51 Community Center. Again, the entire debate on the quote-unquote so-called Ground Zero Mosque, which was again neither at Ground Zero nor a mosque, actually was first publicized on page A1 of the New York Times in December 2009, front and center, and nobody said boo. And it wasn't until 6 months later when two New York Republican primary gubernatorial candidates were duking it out, and one of them decided to take out a 30-second TV spot because the other one supported the center and called it the Ground Zero Mosque, and it became an international firestorm. And again, this is how important media meta-narratives are, Peter, because we kept hearing Ground Zero Mosque from the opponents so much that even our liberal allies started to call it the Ground Zero Mosque. And what was even more disconcerting at the time was even leading Democrats like Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid and former presidential candidate Howard Dean both spoke out against the mosque and said that it should be moved. Now, Harry Dean could not order a sandwich off of a menu most days, but on this he decided to have a backbone. And again, I am a leftist Democrat. I don't hide that very well. But I want to reiterate that, again, this sort of Islamophobia, this sort of pandering for cheap political points is not exclusive to the Republican Party. In the 2008 presidential election, how many people in this room remember seeing a picture of Barack Obama wearing a Kenyan white garb and white headdress, right? We all remember that. What most people don't know is that photograph was leaked by the Hillary Clinton campaign. Yeah, that's the response that I usually get. And again, so that's what, and the whisper campaigns during the 2008 election of Barack being some sort of crypto-Muslim Manchurian candidate were so toxic that we saw no Democrats speak out against it. And only 1 month before the election in October 2008, it took the gravitas of former Secretary of State Colin Powell to go and meet the press and basically tell his fellow Republicans to shut the hell up before they finally did. So again, they saw no meaningful pushback from the Democratic Party. They see that Muslims are, a disenfranchised group. And again, for those of you in this audience who might think that Barack Obama is a Muslim, as a leftist, socialist, Muslim human rights lawyer from Chicago, I've met him. He doesn't know our secret handshake, so I can assure you that he's not. I feel like I have to say that in every one of my talks. But again, because if you don't laugh, you'll cry, right? But again, this is something that we're having to deal with, and without that meaningful ally support, and Peter, you and I know this from being pundits. I love going on national television and speaking out against anti-Semitism. Why? Because as an ally, I think it carries more weight. Just like Peter, I know you love going on television and speaking out against Islamophobia, because people will listen to Peter on Islamophobia and they'll listen to me on anti-Semitism. We need to speak out for one another. And just because we're not a Muslim, or we're not Jewish, or we're not a gay person, or not an undocumented immigrant, or we have health care and we don't care about universal, we have to speak out for one another. And that's the only way we're going to be able to push our society forward.
Well, on that excellent note, let's turn it over to you. I think we have microphones. Okay, great. So why don't we start here in the front? Just wait for the microphone, I think.
Thank you. The Ground Zero Mosque was really supposed to be a community center at the Sacred Burlington Coat Center site. But here's my question. I get upset as an American about our strange bedfellows, that I do not agree with much of anything that the government of Saudi Arabia stands for, and yet we're best buds. The financing for 9/11 came from there, but we attacked Afghanistan. And I have a feeling that this is more of upper crust economics and power brokering, using local power brokers who disenfranchise their own citizens, and we go along with it, and then they buy our Americans as the cannon fodder for the wars in their countries. What about that? Am I off the wall, or is that not a big part of this whole foreign policy problem?
Okay, so the question was about America's relationship with Saudi Arabia.
Similar.
Right. Either of you guys want to
Ne'er-do-wells.
jump in on that?
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about not being a fan of Saudi Arabia, you and me both. And that's something important to keep in mind is that, again, just because Saudi Arabia likes to, posit itself as a Muslim country, that they do things that are un-Islamic, just things that are on its face. For example, the notion that women can't work in Saudi Arabia is absolutely absurd because the Prophet Muhammad's wife, Khadija, was actually one of the most successful merchants at the time. I mean, so the godmother of Islam not only worked, but was a successful businesswoman. And so that's what we're talking about here, is that, what we see from so-called Muslim nations, we don't like to juxtapose on Islam, because again, if you look at, even though many Muslim countries have an abysmal record on minority rights or, gender equality, 4 out of 57 Muslim majority nations have already elected a female head of state, which is something that we as Americans have not done. 5 out of the last 12 Nobel Peace Prizes were won by Muslims. 3 of them were women. Right? So again, we all have a long way to go, but again, as long as we continue to look through things through a very myopic lens, it's the same way that I don't want people to view the United States of America, because again, like I said, when I go on Al Jazeera, a lot of people think that all Americans are, gun-toting redneck sons of bitches, and we're not. Right? And that's the thing, is we're trying to shatter these monoliths. And there's so many things that go into all of the world's problems. And, a 1-hour panel is certainly not going to tackle all of these things. But again, it's important to keep in mind that, a lot of the critiques of Islam, so-called Islamic countries, are coming from Muslims themselves.
And I think one of the other big critique of America is that we have helped support some of the regimes, some of the authoritarian regimes for almost 40 years. Imagine if Bush was president for 40 years, what would we be doing in this country? We can't even tolerate
Moving Canada?
people. Yeah. No, I'm just saying, and then there was some country that was making sure that he stayed in power. I'm just using Bush as an example. It's the only good example I could come up with. But the truth is that we have helped maintain authoritarian regimes, and it's one of the pet peeves, one of the root causes of why people feel disenfranchised, because they feel that they have no opportunity, they have no say in their future, they can't bring about the kind of change they want to bring about, and then they think that America is somehow responsible for maintaining these regimes for its own good. And this is one of the root causes. If you read into root causes of why the terrorists have become terrorists, is because they feel that the only way out is to create extreme violence so that they can bring attention to their cause. I'm not justifying it at all, because I'm actually against them and don't believe in any of their tactics, but this is one of the rationales that they use.
Go ahead.
Thank you. If I may just add a few things rather than a question. As a Muslim, I hope it will be informative, and I'll be very brief. You had raised the question about how America will change Islam, how it will modify it. I'm an example. I came to the States in the late 69, just around when the Vietnam War was ending. I'm a physician. I've been here for more than 40 years. My Islam is changing. When I was in Pakistan, very simple example. The Holy Quran is very holy, and mother will wrap it up in flannel and put it high up there and take it down and kiss it. And then we will have to, over here, when I started going to the mosque and started teaching children in Sunday school, we took out a Quran and we took the yellow highlighter and we put it in here and we walked around just like a book to learn from it, because back home, we didn't really learn about it. We're just Muslims. The second point I want to make is that, which has not been discussed very deeply, is the impact of culture. Islam is all over the world. Chinese Muslims practice Islam differently than the one in Saudi Arabia, the one in Sudan. And so I'm going to be practicing, and I'm already changing how I'm going to be practicing Islam in America. So I'm an American, and this culture, this mixture of all the other faiths and good people around is modifying the way I will practice. The core values are the same. Some of the rituals will change and some of the other things will change, but other than that, I think this issue of Saudi Arabia and other countries, it is the culture. When we go for Hajj, the most sacred annual pilgrimage, women are not allowed to cover their face. You cannot perform that ritual with your face covered. And yet, in Saudi Arabia, which is the home of Islam, women cover their face. So these are cultural things which become Islamic, which are not, and we need to distinguish the two. Thank you for the time.
Great, thank you. Let's go on. Go ahead. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming. I grew up in a country where, which has a secular identity, not because of Islam, but because of this code of social status, which is Tunisia. The former president had made his own interpretation, and we come out with this status where we're not following actually what's written in Quran, basically what concerns the human rights. You've mentioned a while ago that American values are the same as Islam value. Well, I don't think the American values teach people or allow people or recommend a man to beat his wife. This is clearly mentioned in Quran. My question is, when are you going to look introspectively, and instead of talking about sympathizing and calling people for saying, talking about Muslims the majority of Muslims don't know anything about what's in Islam and what's in Quran. I mean, the ideology, they're just following. They don't read, they're just consuming, and because it's religion, they don't think reflectively about it. When we start thinking reflectively about it, we discover that women can be beaten in Quran, and this is a verse. And if I want to stick to the verse, I think nobody can stop me. Don't tell me that, no, there is another interpretation. When we read Quran, women inherit half of what men can inherit. That's not fair either for women, as far as women. Not to talk about the other Islamic legacy, because I know very much about it, and the hadith and whatever. So my question is, when are we going to say the truth? Instead of talking about Muslims. Muslims are very peaceful people.
Okay.
Talk about the ideology.
So I think, all right, so I think we understand the question. The question had to do with questions in Islam about inheritance and about being able to beat women and right, the ideology. Okay, so again, I thank you for articulating that, because I think this is a kind of argument that we hear a lot, and so I think it's good that you guys have the opportunity to respond to it. So why don't I give you both a chance?
Well, the difficulty with the questions that she's asked is that each of them require a little bit of nuance, because you have to really explain what she's saying. First of all, I applaud you for asking that question, because these are the same questions that I asked myself when I started the organization, WISE. It was one of the things that we really, really delved into our scripture to see. This is just one of the verses that you've mentioned, the Daraba verse, which says that you can beat your wife. So what happened was in 2006, when we had our conference, a woman came up to the podium and said, "Can I please speak?" And she was not meant to be a panelist, and I said, "Sure." She said, "I'm working on something, it's a research, and I just want to see what these 200 sisters, how they will respond to my research." Her name is Lali Bakhtiyar. She stepped up to the podium, and she told the women there that for 7 years she'd been translating the Quran. And then she fell upon this verse 434, which basically was addressing the man if he was having difficulty with his wife on how to address that issue. One was, literally to speak to your wife, then to leave the bed, and then if that doesn't work, then you hit her, which is exactly the translation that has been used in all the English translations. So she said she froze and she shut the Quran. She said, this cannot be the God that I know. And because she was a scholar, she really wanted to go in deep. And so for many, I think, months, she was just pondering on this. And then she decided to do some research on this particular word, daraba, which was mentioned in the Quran. And she said, where else does this word in the Quran appear? And she looked at many instances where the same word was used and noticed that the word was not translated as beat in other instances. It was to go away, leave, dispense. It was never beat. So she said, so why is it always in this particular verse does this word called daraba? So then she asked 30 scholars, because she's a scholar, she wanted to really go deep. So she asked every scholar 3 questions. She said, did the Prophet do everything that was in the Quran? The Quran we believe to be the word of God, and Prophet was considered to be the walking Quran. In other words, he did everything that he was, that was revealed to him. And all the scholars said, oh yes, he was a walking Quran. She said, did the Prophet ever beat his wife? No, he was never known. He had conflict because he hasn't made many wives. And then the third question was, what did the Prophet do when he had a conflict? He would always leave. She said, that is the correct translation. Now, she was the first one, excuse me, let me finish because this is not a question of who's going to win and who's going to lose. We're talking religion and we're talking nuance. So basically what happened was that she translated this, and when she translated it this way, we shared it with a number of scholars, and now in America and in other places, we've even had a court use this particular verse. And I have seen a number of Muslim scholars who have adopted this. And there was an Ayatollah in Iran who told her, your interpretation is the correct interpretation. The Prophet never beat his wife, and nobody should ever beat his wife, because the Quran talks about men and women being garments of one another. It makes no sense whatsoever to beat your wife in any circumstance. So this is the interpretation we are using now. This is called ijtihad, my dear. This is called ijtihad.
No, ma'am. We can talk more about it later, but I do think that, ma'am, excuse me, there's a panel, right? So you ask a question, and they have the right to respond to it. Arslan, do you want to respond to this? No. Okay. I just would say, I think it's if you as it happens in this week's Parsha, this week's Torah portion, double portion called Tazria Matzorah, there is a discussion of women's impurity after childbirth that would, if read on its face, I think make most of our stomachs turn, right? So sometimes when people say we don't know what's in the Quran, I often think, how much do they know about what's actually in the Hebrew Bible, right? There is an interpretive tradition, there are different interpretive traditions that try to make sense of texts that were written a very, very long time ago. Some of those interpretive traditions, it can accentuate the level, the kind of patriarchy and misogyny and homophobia and violence, and others can try to reconcile them in light of human reason and human progress. And it seems to me that's something that's true within all religious traditions. Go ahead.
One of the things that I find a problem is the fact that we don't understand, we as Americans don't understand the community. We hear about Sunni and Shia, but you people have talked for 40 minutes and never addressed that. But we look at it and we hear about all the killings that are going on, and we associate that with the Muslims of America, who I have no idea whether you are one or the other or neither. The second thing is that
Quickly on the second thing.
What's that?
Quickly, go ahead, yeah.
The second is the idea that imams have not spoken out. You turn on the radio occasionally and you hear a rabbi come on and talk about certain things. I've never heard an imam come out and talk about anything.
Okay, I think we got it. So the first was about Sunni Shia, and the second was about why imams, you don't hear imams condemning.
Thank you.
Okay, great, great. Arsen, do you want to take?
Yeah. So to the first part of your question, sir, you know, a lot of the Sunni Shia sectarian divide, you know, that we've started to see explode over the last 10 or 12 years was a direct byproduct of our American intervention in Iraq. It was our attempt at balkanizing Iraq with the Kurds in the north, Sunni Shias. You know, Sunnis and Shias before the Iraq war were intermarrying. They were living in the same neighborhoods. And again, you know, this is sort of our American history of dividing and conquering, right? And similarly, you know, you see this in many other parts of the world as well. But the great thing about, again, the great thing about the American Muslim community is that, you know, we don't really view ourselves along sectarian lines because, and this is what I say at all my talks, is that when people attack us for being Muslims, they attack us for just being Muslim. They don't differentiate that you're a Sunni Muslim, so I'm going to attack you, or you're a Shia, and I'm going to attack you. And again, because of the fact that we want to acknowledge that there is diversity of thought and opinion within the Islamic tradition, and we don't want to sort of perpetuate those sorts of sectarian divides. To the second part of your question, what was the second part again?
About imams not condemning.
Yeah, okay, so if I had a dime for every time somebody told me that Muslims don't condemn terrorism, I wouldn't have to be here tonight. And the very simple response that I give to anyone, and please, I welcome you all to use this with your spheres of influence and your friends. When somebody says that Muslims don't condemn terrorism, I would like you to tell them that if you type in the word Muslim condemn terrorism into Google, you'll receive 17 million results. 17 million results. So if you still after that do not believe that Muslims do not condemn terrorism, you do not know how to use a computer. And you do not want to listen because you've already made up your mind, and that's fine. You're completely entitled to that. But again, we want to base things on facts. And again, I always tell people, if you don't think Muslims condemn terrorism, type it into Google, and you'll be able to spend all day reading what we've said.
Okay.
And I'll just mention
okay.
one more thing on this issue. The community guide that's coming out, we did this, we actually have a section called For the Record of all the condemnations that Muslims have done, so that you, at your leisure, can read this, because it may be hard to go into Google and sift through all that. So we sifted through all that. We have about 700 condemnations just from here, the United States and other people. And it's really important to know that Muslims have spoken out. Right after 9/11, 5 major scholars issued a major fatwa saying that 9/11 was a terrorist attack on the United States of America, and gave permission to Muslims who were in the army that had to go fight fellow Muslims in Afghanistan. That fatwa was issued literally like 7 days after. And I remember a reporter from New York Times, really good religion reporter, who called my husband, who's an imam, and said, "What do you think of this?" He said, "This should be on the front page of Nation Challenge section." Do you remember that section? It was a special section where we showed, you know, we would profile what was going on. And it was nowhere. It was in C5 section, like a tiny little thing. Now, as an American, if you had seen that kind of condemnation from 5 major jurists around the world, calling this a terrorist attack and giving permission to Muslim military force people to go and fight against fellow Muslims because their country had been attacked, you would have thought of us very differently. And that's the problem. You don't hear about these condemnations.
In the back. You may just hold on. I think someone will bring you the microphone.
I was wondering, you talked about America's footprint in Muslim countries. Do you think that if Hillary Clinton became president, I mean, obviously she's condemned people like Trump and Cruz and their rhetoric, but do you think if she became president, because, you know, she wants to continue the occupation of Palestine, she wants to, you know, she's always threatening to bomb Iran, and she wants to start all these wars and stuff. Do you think if she becomes president, sorry, I kind of exaggerated there. She doesn't, I mean, she has very harsh rhetoric about our, you know, enemies in the Middle East and stuff like that. And do you think that if she became president, it might exacerbate problems of radicalization by continuing our sort of military misadventures in the region? Even though we know that she doesn't dislike Muslims or anything like that, but do you think she could inadvertently?
So the question is about Hillary Clinton's foreign policy in the Middle East.
Yeah. So to answer your question, I do agree that Hillary does have a more hawkish foreign policy compared to Bernie Sanders. I think the main distinction, though, is that we would never, ever, 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 ever hear an iota of the rhetoric coming from her mouth that we hear from every Republican presidential candidate. So it would be a night and day difference I mean, it is intellectually dishonest to say that it would be the same in terms of rhetoric, and oftentimes, ladies and gentlemen, rhetoric is what matters. I mean, at the end of the day, the president is the commander-in-chief of the United States Armed Forces, and their job is to command the armed forces of the United States. Now, whether she wants to be a hawkish foreign policy as compared to a Bernie Sanders with a more dovish foreign policy, that's fine. But it's all about rhetoric, right? As long as she's not, holding mission accomplished, press conferences on, the stage of an aircraft carrier, or calling people the axis of evil, or talking about these sorts of things, I think again we're going to see a night and day difference between her and pretty much any Republican presidential candidate out there today.
You want to jump in on this one? Okay. Sir? Go ahead. Yeah. Just the microphone will come to you.
Yes. Could you comment on whether there is any reality to the polls reported by Bill Maher and others? I mean, the irrationality of his arguments hardly merit comment, but he keeps citing polls of European Muslims who believe that people who leave the faith should be killed, and anti-gay and anti-feminist comments. Is there any reality to those polls at all?
Right. So the question is, what about people like Bill Maher who cite polls which show that large percentages of Muslims hold views that we would consider to be deeply illiberal?
I think Peter can attest to this. You can pretty much find a public opinion poll to satisfy anything that you want. And in my upcoming book, Scapegoats on Islamophobia, I have a chapter that's called "Conservatives and Bill Maher Against Islam," because for some reason that dude hates us with the heat of a seething nova, which is fine. He's entitled to that. But he has no intellectual honesty in many of his debates. He brings on people that basically just parrot his own talking points. And again, that's fine. He has a show, and that's his platform, and so be it. Again, there are worrying trends all over the world. But again, to cherry pick, public opinion polls, again, we could sit here and do the same thing. There's no amount. There's no science in it. There's no nuance. I mean, his guests have called Islam a death cult and all that stuff. And so that's about as much oxygen as I'm going to waste on Bill Maher.
Go ahead, sir. No, the microphone's coming.
Thank you very much. One two-part question. I couldn't see who the gentleman was, but someone raised the question about education, about the Muslim world. And the question really ends up being, is that the responsibility of the person who wants to be educated? Should the West educate itself about the Muslim world, or does the Muslim world reach out and try to educate the West? I mean, it really, because if you think of the Muslim world as a world of terrorism, as conflicted ideals, which are really different from the West as we know it, they're not going to do that. So it really begins with your beginning bias. Either you go out there and figure out, my doctor is Muslim, he's cool. My son's got a Muslim girlfriend, she's cool, etc. And then you have to reach out and educate yourself. The government's not going to educate you, neither there's not anyone else. So that was a comment on what I heard there.
Now the question. Yeah.
Now the question was, so looking at the Quran, looking at the Muslim setup, infrastructure, does secularism and federalism really have a space in that viewpoint, in that perspective for the long term? Because a lot of the problems seem to grow out of that. So Saudi Arabia is trying to be a federal central authority in what would appear to have been a religion which started to get away from the notion of institutionalism and central authority. And how do we reconcile that with the increasing federalism in the global currents?
Okay, so your question was, is there a space for secularism and federalism in Islam? Those are the questions? Okay. Which of you would like to take that? Go ahead.
I think America is supposed to be a secular country, but yet Muslims consider America to be the most Islamic country in the world. And it doesn't mean that it's Muslim majority country. It's how you define the country. It lives up to the ideals of the core objectives of Sharia, which is the furtherance of life, the furtherance of your religion, the furtherance of your intellect, of your wealth, of your dignity and family. Those are the 6 major rights that every human being has under Islamic law. Granted, half the people don't live up to it. Just like we did not live up to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness for some people, and we are seeing that struggle being played out, Muslims do not live up to that ideal either. So yes, secularism absolutely has a place. There is a verse in the Quran that says there is no compulsion in religion, which means that every human being has the free will to choose God or not to choose God. And the Quran does not call for any type of state. There is no mention of a caliphate. There is no mention of a monarchy. There is no mention of what type of state you should have. It's just that these are the 6 rights the people who govern have to give those who they are governing. And that is, but you know, of course, like everything else, we've had 1,400 years of history, and you have had monarchies develop, you've had nation states develop, you've had all kinds of things develop, some of them replicating what happened in the West, and some of them really simply coming out of just, you know, just the way things evolve. And, but Muslims are very happy in this country. And if we could take the American model and replicate it elsewhere, not the European model. Why? Because America is basically a religion that honors faith and respects faith.
I mean,
and
a country.
A country, sorry, what did I say?
A religion.
Oh, religion. No, maybe a Freudian slip. No, it's a country that, you know, its foundational value is religious freedom. And this is why so many religious communities come here and flourish. And this is why we had the Vatican II. And this is why Judaism was able to create a reform movement. And this is why we Muslims are hopeful, because we think we can create something significant here as well.
Go ahead.
I consider myself.
All right, just wait.
I consider myself an agnostic ally, and I've spent time in Indonesia and Turkey and have a lot of good friends. And yet, when I try to confront Islamophobia, I feel like these walls just go up, and nothing I say makes a difference. What can allies do to be more effective?
Again, what allies can do, and I say this in all of my talks, is reach out to your spheres of influence, your networks and friends, families, and I realize some people you're not going to get to, but again, people within your spheres of influence, your parents, your uncles, your sisters, your brothers, your friends are more likely to listen to you as opposed to listening to some idiot pundit that they see on television. And again, it's the example that I always give is the marriage equality debate. Right? In the 1990s, gay marriage was the most vitriolic, polarizing debate in the United States of America. But what we started to see with this humanization process was that as the marriage equality debate began to become more humanized, you know, it lost its political toxicity or radioactivity. So you could be the most, you know, right-wing, evangelical, Christian voter who might be opposed to gay marriage, but you probably have a gay cousin somewhere, right? So it's like, well, I'm opposed to gay marriage, but my cousin Joe's gay and he's the greatest guy in the world. So I always joke that I wish people had Muslim cousins to humanize us to them. But again, we don't have that luxury. But again, it's getting out to your spheres of influence. So, you know, if your crazy uncle or your crazy aunt says something at Thanksgiving dinner, if you push back, they again are much more likely to at least take a moment of pause, as opposed to listening to, you know, people like us who are supposed to stand up for Muslims. And again, like you said, some people are just going to put up a wall. But again, it's just going out there, and whenever you see anything, and again, this is not just exclusive to Islamophobia. If you see anything that's Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, homophobic, anti-immigrant, anti-anything, speak out against it, because I promise you, it is going to have more of an effect on your social networks than, again, people that, you know, they see on TV every day. So again, as you know, Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local, and nothing is more local than your friends and your family.
Great. Well, I think that's a wonderful note to end on. It's 7:45, which is the closing time. Thank you, Arsalan, so much for coming. Thank you, Daisy, and thank all of you very much.
Thank you.